So hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Salvador Munoz, and I'm the Associate Director of Public Programs and Outreach at Poster House, the first and only museum in the United States dedicated to the art and history of the poster. I am so excited to welcome you to tonight's program, Fashioning the Self, I Am My Own Property. Now, if you've had a chance to visit our Ethel Reed exhibition on view at Poster House through August 21st, you'll know that the artist used fashion and photography to construct and control the narrative around her work. But Ethel wasn't the only woman of her time to leverage fashion to her advantage. How are Black women using clothing and sartorial autonomy to project new narratives? Tonight, Jonathan Michael Square and Elizabeth Way will lead us through an exploration of the turn of the century fashion of African Americans. Jonathan Michael Square is an assistant professor of Black visual culture at Parsons School of Design, as well as a fellow in the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He founded and runs the digital humanities project, Fashioning the Self in Slavery and Freedom, from which this program takes its name. Elizabeth Way is an associate curator at the museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology. Sorry, that was a mouthful. Her exhibitions include Global Fashion Capitals, Black Fashion Designers, Fabric and Fashion, and Head to Toe, which is currently on view.
Just closed.
Which just closed. Before we get started, I wanted to share a few notes on accessibility for this event. Automated closed captioning is available for those who need it, and you can turn it on or off by clicking the CC button on the bottom of your screen. This program will be recorded and made available for all audiences after the event. And if you have any questions during the program, you can drop them in the questions in the chat or the Q&A box at any time, and I will go ahead and vocalize them for you. If you could just remember to set your chat to everyone so that everyone can see your questions and I don't look like I'm talking to myself, that would be appreciated. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Jonathan and Elizabeth.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. And I'm always excited to speak at Poster House. I love you all, particularly Salvador and Maya. Maya, if you're watching, we miss you. And of course, it's always a pleasure and honor to be in conversation with Liz. We hadn't done the event together in a while, actually.
A long time, since before the pandemic. So
yeah,
really
excited. Crazy. Yeah, so it's always fun, chopping it up with you. So I'm excited to really jump into this.
Definitely.
So let me share my screen. All right. So as Salvador said, the name of our presentation is based on my project, but also based on the name of the exhibition. So we were really inspired by the exhibition that's up at Poster House right now on Ethel Reed. And Liz and I had the opportunity to get a personal walkthrough of the exhibition by Salvador. And we learned a lot. And it really was the jumping off point for the presentation that we created for today.
And we want to say that, the turn of the century is a really interesting time for women, Black women, but like all American women, because there's a lot of social kind of mores that are shifting. And it is a kind of a time that is ripe for reinvention, especially through kind of clothing and presenting of the self and kind of creating a new narrative for oneself, and how you present yourself is such a huge part of that. So this was a really exciting topic to dig into.
And Liz is really modest, but she's actually in the process of doing a PhD. And you're actually focusing on Black women and their self-fashioning from this period.
Yes, and my period extends a little bit further from 1865, from emancipation to the end of the 20s. But this is a big chunk of time in which we see, and my project specifically focuses on respectability politics, which has a lot to do with the way Black women present themselves and how they feel they can or can't present themselves. And so I think that has a lot to do with kind of the women that we picked here today.
Also, I think it's important to point out that this time period has been getting a lot of attention lately. So there's the HBO series Gilded Age, and the Met Gala, actually, the theme of the Met Gala was a riff off the Gilded Age. So people are thinking about this turn of the century moment. I do think we need to problematize that term, Gilded Age, because like gilded for whom? But it is people are thinking about this sort of late Victorian, Edwardian, turn of the century moment. And so we were thinking about the Ethel Reed exhibition when we came up with this presentation, but we're also thinking about sort of like the popular zeitgeist, thinking about the Gilded Age moment.
And I think this is a moment that is really something that people draw on a lot, because for not for us, but for our parents, like their grandparents would have been kind of alive in this era. And so we think about kind of terms like vintage, or like, I think a lot about like in the 1970s, they had this resurgence of like granny boots, and they're called that because like at that time, those people's grandmothers would have worn them. And these are Edwardian, late Victorian kind of styles. So I think that when people kind of generally think of historic fashion or history, this is a time that people reach to a lot, right? Because the 1920s seem so distinctive to us, and kind of in certain ways birthed this idea of what modernity looks like. And so the period right before that is kind of like history. So I think that this is a really interesting period, and one that is looked at a lot, but maybe not so much understood.
I agree with you. Like people don't really understand this period. Like I noticed there's a lot of confusion about like just dress practices and silhouettes from this era. Just look at some of the mistakes that were made at the Met Gala. Anything that's sort of corseted and bustled sort of gets like lumped into like this Gilded Age period.
And we can talk about a little bit about the particulars, but it's interesting because when we think about modern fashion, this is really a period when we start to see it really take center stage in women's lives. We still have this kind of what we would think of couture, but like custom dressmakers. Still plenty of people going to custom dressmakers because they do want a very specific tight fit. But ready-to-wear fashion for women comes in the 1860s, starting with blouses and things like that. But by the 1870s, 1880s, you can get an entire dress off the rack. So it really picks up during the 1920s because the silhouette simplifies so much. But there's a lot of like ready-made fashion that's happening in this period as well, and that's really changing the dynamic of how people are buying clothes and how they're presenting themselves and what people can afford. You have a lot of industrially made things that are made to mimic very precious materials. Like you have kind of early plastics that look like tortoiseshell, or, things like gilding, that can mimic gold, and fake jewels and things like that. And so it gives working class and middle class people access to kind of the look of fashion that for so long was only restricted to the upper class. So you have, I think, one of the biggest things in this period, especially when you think about mainstream American society, is this class fluidity. And even when you think about the Gilded Age and those kind of robber barons, they were kind of considered nouveau riche by a lot of, kind of more established, kind of wealthy families in different parts of the country. So this idea of class slippage is really, really prevalent in this period. Not that it didn't exist before, but it's really a time when people are moving to urban areas and kind of reinventing themselves. And I think we see that with women like Ethel Reed, but also with kind of the women we're going to discuss here.
Yeah, and that's the great thing about presenting with you, Liz. You're such a wealth of knowledge. You really provide that much context. So that's great. So as we said, Ethel Reed was a master of self-fashioning and understood the power of her own beauty as a tool of self-promotion. So taking inspiration from the current exhibition, we're exploring this dynamic from the perspective as scholars of Black fashion. Reed wasn't the only figure from this period who used her own image to bolster her standing and career. A number of turn-of-the-century Black it girls also deserve our scholarly attention. Tonight, we will focus on Black women from the turn of the century to the early 20th century, sorry, that's a typo, who were tastemakers and arbiters of style. So the first is Ciceretta Jones. And this presentation is organized roughly chronologically by birth date. So we start off with Ciceretta Jones, 1868. She was an African-American soprano who often performed for exclusively white audiences who thought of her as both a novelty, but also she was valued for her unique talent. She went by the nickname the Black Patty, which is a riff off the Italian opera singer Adelina Patti.
And she was, I mean, she was a really extraordinary person. I think I definitely not someone who was kind of as widely known as she should be, but she was the first Black woman to sing at Carnegie Hall. This was in 1893. But she was also really, even though she performed for all white audiences, she was very proud of her Black heritage. And, you know, people had suggested to her, a reporter suggested to her at one point that she should try and pass for white. And she was just, you know, completely rejected that idea, like that she would never deny kind of her own people. And so I think that that is a really beautiful aspect of her, not only as a famous person, but as like a very proud and like celebrated Black woman. And so, Jonathan, do you want to get started, or do you want me to start and talk a little bit about the fashion here?
I'll let you take over this slide.
So she was born in Providence, Rhode Island. And she began performing kind of in like the immediate area. Her, you know, her family wasn't super, super wealthy, but they were not, certainly not kind of poor. And so what we see here is this fashion that she's projecting. And this is, of course, in the middle of her career. She's already a celebrated opera singer. So we see kind of this expression of very, very high fashion in kind of the 1890s. So we see she's very tightly corseted, but she also displays what we call the powder pigeon silhouette, which is kind of ridiculous when you think about it. You can see how the top of her bodice kind of hangs over just a little bit. We have that dip in the front. So she's actually wearing a corset, which would have been very, very fashionable at this time, that works to push your hips backward and your chest forward. So if you kind of think about that for a second, you can think about how perhaps unused to that posture we would be today. But of course, like, you know, the idea of wearing a corset and the idea of comfort is a very, it's a thing, it's an idea that changes over time, right? What is comfortable to us, having our body like completely free, would not have been considered comfortable for people in other eras. People liked kind of to be supported. But you can see this is a very fashionable silhouette, and we can compare the dress that she's wearing to a piece by Charles Frederick Worth. So he was kind of billed as the first Parisian couturier, changed the way kind of dressmaking was conducted in Paris through a lot of different business practices. It was made to measure things, very, very expensive, but he actually kind of created more of a assembly line kind of way of doing things. So he was able to make a lot of money. But the details here, you know, the fringe, the swags, the ruffle, the train, all of this, we really do think of the Gilded Age, right? It's more on top of more. And you can see just every little detail. And this is a piece that's in the collection of the Met Museum. It dates to 1885. And this is actually a court presentation gown. So this would have been the kind of fanciest gown even a very wealthy woman would ever wear. This would be for her presentation to the Queen of England. And so this is kind of the apex of what kind of formal fashion, formal daytime fashion look like. But you can see these really significant comparisons to what Sister Jones is wearing in the train, in the luxury of the textiles. And so she's really playing on a very high level here when we think about fashion and presentation. She understands kind of fashion. She's very fluent and literate in, you know, what this means to present yourself and to engage in fashion in this way.
And, you know, as we're preparing for today's presentation and like researching images of Sister Jones, there are a lot of images of her, which tells me that one, people viewed her as being beautiful, but also she viewed herself as being beautiful and wanted to sit for a number of portraits. And I was really struck by the number of photographs that are easily accessible, even now and like over a century after she was alive. So I thought that was really interesting as well.
And it really makes you think of kind of the political nature of Black folks like photographing themselves in portraits at that time. I mean, a generation before, we have Frederick Douglass, who, you know, set out to be the most photographed man in the 19th century because he wanted to produce positive images of Black people. And that was a political act for him. And so this may or may not have been kind of top of her mind when she thinks about this, but she's certainly aware that she's capturing an image that is going to last in some capacity. Maybe she didn't know it would last all the way to 2022, but a positive image of a beautiful Black woman who's not only beautiful, very, very talented, you know, self-employed. You know, we might not think of her that way, but I think it's a very political act when when Black people take their picture and circulate it. And we can kind of connote that to the ways kind of images and even videos have been circulated in our current moment. But this is something that goes way back.
Absolutely. And there's an artist that Liz and I really admire. Her name is Elizabeth Colomba. She was born in France, but her parents are from Martinique. And she created a portrait of Ciceretta Jones, and we would be remiss not to include it in today's presentation. But the name of the portrait is Siempre Libera. In the portrait, we see Ciceretta Jones sort of in the middle of a song at Carnegie Hall. As Liz pointed out, she was the first Black woman to perform at Carnegie Hall. And there's, you can imagine there's applause from the audience, there's confetti raining down in like a moment of ecstasy. And I think the title of the work is really telling as well. It's a reference, of course, to an aria, but also I think it speaks to like Black female agency, which is something that's very central to Elizabeth Colomba's practice.
And you can see one of the things that I really, really love about Elizabeth Colomba is that she is really interested in real material objects. And so you can see that she actually looked at a real dress. This is another one by Charles Frederick Worth. It dates to about 1882. And she kind of used the details of this real dress in her portrait. So I think it lends it like a really beautiful quality that kind of places it in time. But what's interesting about this actual dress, it's an evening dress. It also has this kind of ethereal quality that really would have been kind of perfect for an opera performance, almost looking like a costume with these beautiful garlands and the draped kind of sheer fabric. And we're going to talk a little bit about our next person and think a little bit more about Bohemian styles. We certainly wouldn't kind of equate the Gilded Age with Bohemian kind of movements, even though they certainly existed at that time. But I think that there's a kind of a touch of that in this, touch of this avant-garde in the design of even this Worth dress.
Yeah, and I just have to repeat something that Liz said about Columba being a very studied artist. She's come to the Costume Institute and has looked at pieces in the collection and has based works on pieces in the Costume Institute's collection. So she's very much someone who looks at actual objects in material culture and incorporates them into her works.
And I certainly encourage you to look up more of her works. They're absolutely breathtaking. And you can see the way she paints fabrics, furniture as well as clothing. You can tell that she looks at real things.
So our next figure is Aida Orvington Walker. And Aida was an African-American vaudeville performer, actress, singer, dancer, and choreographer. And she was billed as the queen of the cakewalk. And also what I think is interesting is that she performed in Ciceretta Jones's Troubadour group. So they knew each other and performed together.
And she actually met her husband while she was performing. So she was married to George Walker. And so Walker was a part of a duo, Walker and Williams, who are very, very famous African-American vaudeville kind of duo. And so she was sometimes performed kind of in tandem with them, certainly kind of in the same circles. Sometimes I think she gets a little bit of short shrift for being kind of George Walker's wife, but she's certainly so fascinating in her own right. And you can see, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, you can see two extremely different styles that she's kind of rocking in these two photos. And I definitely want to talk a little bit more about that, but what were you gonna say?
Oh, and I was going to say something very similar. I was going to say, like in preparation for today's talk, like we were most struck by the images of her, so much so that we chose the image on the left as like the promotional image for the presentation. Like Ciceretta Jones, like the images of her are just really striking. Like, I mean, people think that posing started like in the 20th century, but clearly she's serving in both of these pictures.
And I mean, this is a woman who's an actress. And so she's a person who's used to kind of taking on different personas. And so when you look at kind of, especially this photograph on the left, it certainly expresses something that is very current at the time that it was taken at the turn of the century in like the early 1900s. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's like kind of an accurate depiction of like fashion on the street. But it's very, very telling of kind of fashionable trends. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But I just want to contrast it with the image on the right, which is what we might kind of consider more kind of true to historical fashion. But I want to point out these beautiful kind of Art Nouveau kind of swirls and floral elements of her dress. And you can also see how the silhouette has changed slightly, very slightly, I think to some eyes from our slides before, but we can start to see this more modern kind of shape taking place. Fashion is getting kind of much more practical, even though we certainly wouldn't consider it practical to us, but we start to see like two-piece dresses or like blouses and skirts that would have been much more casual than what she has on here, but it's giving women a lot of choices. It's kind of designed for women to work in, you know, and this is a huge period where we start seeing women doing things like bicycling. And so we do see the fashion kind of adapting to that, even if it certainly isn't our idea of kind of sportswear or kind of comfortable clothing. But here we see her kind of performing two different personas, one that is very high fashion and very kind of respectable in its own way. This would have been kind of considered a very showy kind of ensemble for like someone following strict respectability politics. I'm talking about the image on the right. But then on the left, you see her kind of really throwing that idea over and giving us this this costumed kind of almost Salome type of image that we see here.
And so we wanted to talk a little bit about the cakewalk. She was billed Queen of the Cakewalk. So we included this presentation, this early film of performers doing a cakewalk.
You see.
There's no sound.
There's no sound, so I'm going to talk a little bit over it. But the cakewalk was this dance that was developed during in the antebellum period. And it was originally kind of this very like exaggerated dance kind of walk, kind of promenade that African Americans would do. And it was really kind of mocking.
Presentation of the Library of.
It was really kind of mocking upper class white people in a way. There was a lot of like rituals and events and things that happened within kind of the enslavement within the period that was considered like valves to release kind of the tension within the slave community. And so they would have different celebrations around Christmas or other kind of holidays where they would have like kind of these almost like carnival type of activities. And sometimes these included kind of this reversal of roles, right? Like where enslaved people kind of took on these social leadership roles in which they were kind of given a little bit of license to make fun of white people, their owners, and it was kind of seen as this way to blow off some steam. And it was obviously very, very restricted to these kind of periods. And we see this happen in New England as well as in the South. And this changes as kind of the nature of slavery changes and as slavery becomes much more mercantile as we get up to the 1860s, like activities like this definitely stop. But the cakewalk kind of continues, and it's an interesting kind of phenomenon, but it really develops into something that's more about kind of elite aspirations. So you'll notice that all the people in the video are very well dressed. We can certainly equate kind of the dress that the woman was wearing to the dress that we saw on Ada Walker in the previous slide, but it's as much about kind of dancing and really kind of more of a promenade in time, but it's so tied into like what you're wearing and how you're presenting, and this idea of projecting this very kind of elite, almost like overly precious manners. And so I think it's a really interesting kind of convergence of vernacular dance and fashion, because the fashion was 100% kind of tied into it. And I believe it was like a contest, and I think you won a cake, which is why they call it the cakewalk.
Yeah, I love that you brought it back to like African American carnival-esque traditions. I'm always thinking about like Pinkster or Negro Election Day or Junkanoo, and you mentioned Carnival, like these moments of like the rich become poor, the poor become rich, sort of a tongue-in-cheek, sort of like you said, release valve for tension. So yeah, and it's interesting, the term cakewalk has made it into like popular speech. And I think most people say it without really realizing that it has origins in slavery. But I mean, apparently when you did the cakewalk, the idea is that you did it with a certain amount of like aplomb or ease. And so to do like, if it's a cakewalk, it's something that's easy.
If you put too much effort into it, it like kind of takes away from the style. And I mean, that's true of all fashion on any stage, right? Like if it's effortful, it doesn't seem as stylish. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about kind of extant fashion and like the way fashion is changing at this time, because I think some of the image on the previous slide of Ada Walker on the left side, where she's giving a more bohemian vibe, is really drawing from things that are happening and being expressed in different ways in fashion. And so these are two ensembles by Paul Poiret. And I want to point out that both of these are fancy dress costumes. He certainly created fashion, like kind of fashion for the street, although this would have been at the couture level. He's a French couturier. That kind of riffed on some of these motifs, but these two pieces happen to be fancy dress costumes. And dress up balls were huge in the Gilded Age. I mean, it's something that like elite people had done for a very, very long time. But when you think of like the Gilded Age, you think of like Mrs. Astor's ballroom, you know, the 400, all these ideas. A lot of these balls involved costume. And so these are both drawn very, very heavily on kind of this mismatch of Asian and kind of Middle Eastern culture. You see the one on the left. This is from the collection of the museum at FIT, and this is from 1919. You can see it has like this scimitar, like this weapon as a prop, and this turban on both of these styles. The one on the left is from the Met Museum, and this one's 1911. And so, I mean, we could have a whole talk about cultural appropriation here and kind of like how Paul Poiret and many other designers are drawing from these Eastern kind of it's their fantasy of the East more than like it really reflects the way people in the East, especially at this time, were dressing. But this was all inspired again by dance. This is a lot of this came from the influences of the Ballet Russe, which is a Russian dance troupe that went to Paris after the Communist Revolution, and so we start to see these kind of cultural mishmashes happening in Paris, and we see the reverberations of that through the fashion, but through other aspects as well. You know, all the way in the U.S. and really every part of kind of the Western world that's following Parisian fashion. So I think these are really fascinating kind of examples, but looking at how sophisticated Ada Walker was in, the references that she's drawing from. And of course, this isn't a surprise. This woman is an actress. She's very cosmopolitan. She's a performer. She knows what's in style. She's keeping up with all of those things and kind of taking those bits into her persona and changing them to kind of create new personas that fit the times.
So we have a great question from Monica. Do you know if there is any sort of connection between like cakewalks and voguing, like contemporary voguing as we know it?
I have absolutely no idea. Jonathan, do you know anything about that? I mean, I think there certainly has to be kind of a sociological connection, even if there's not a direct kind of evolution. Do you know anything about that, Jonathan?
I don't know if there's a direct connection between voguing and cakewalks, but I do think they're both emblematic of like Black expressive culture. And there definitely was a queer ball culture in places like New Orleans and Washington, D.C. and New York City well into the 19th century. So like, I'm working on a chapter in my book manuscript on a figure named Mary Jones, a Black trans sex worker who lived in New York in the 1830s. And in a court case, she says that they're talking about how her self-presentation, her gender identity, etc. And she's like, the parties I go to, no one has a problem with the way I dress, which for me is like a reference to sort of queer-friendly spaces. And this is in the 1830s. There's another scholar named Jared Channing Joseph, who's writing a book about William Dorsey Swann, who was a drag queen in Washington, D.C. in the 1860s and 1870s. So there is a ball culture in like US metropolises in the 19th century. I've never seen anyone make a connection between voguing and queer ball cultures and the cakewalk, which I think comes from like more plantation life than urban life. But I do think they're both emblematic of like general Black expressive culture, and you can add other things to it. Like we mentioned, Pinkster, Junkanoo, Negro Election Day, Carnival.
And I think it's this element of subversiveness, right? Like that, Black people are always aware of what's happening in mainstream culture. We have no way to avoid it. And we can take bits and pieces of it, but like kind of create something completely new that of course then mainstream culture takes back. And Barbara Cohen Stratner is telling us that our dates are wrong, that Ada Walker actually died in 1914. So excuse the typo on our slides.
Oh.
But if you're looking for her death date, it is actually 1914. Thank you, Barbara.
Yeah, thank you both. Very great, excellent questions. And if you have any more, feel free to drop them in the chat and I'll interject as needed.
So the next figure we want to talk about is Alice Dunbar Nelson. And Alice Dunbar Nelson was Paul Laurence Dunbar's wife, but she was also a literary figure in her own right. And I chose the image of her on the right because I think there are very few examples of portraits of African-American women created by African-American women. And this is an example of that. So the portrait on the right was created by Laura Willer Waring, who was an important portraitist during the Harlem Renaissance and even afterwards. And she, of course, the image on the left is W.E.B. Du Bois. So this slide is kind of doing double duty. I want to talk about Alice Dunbar Nelson, but I also want to talk a little bit about Laura Willer Waring, who was an important understudied African-American female artist from this period.
And I want to point out like the really distinctive dress that Alice Dunbar is wearing. This is a style that was associated with actually a movie called Letty Linton. Actually, I don't know if that's the name of the movie, but Letty Linton was the character. And it's actually a movie that never came out, but the costumes was so popular from it. It was copied by like, on every level, from like high fashion designers to like, department stores, or like, lower department stores. You get a dress like this on every kind of price point, but these very distinctive sleeves and like this beautiful like long length isn't necessarily something we think about when we think about the 1930s. There's some beautiful kind of tailored pieces from that period, but this was a huge trend at that time as well.
Liz, I have a question for you. Like, I'm really struck by like the black fingerless gloves, which seems really modern.
Mm-hmm.
And also she seems to be wearing a head wrap underneath her straw or sort of floppy hat that she's wearing.
Yeah.
On those elements, like I look at this and I wouldn't look at this, if I didn't know the context for it, I wouldn't say 1920s. This portrait's from 1927.
Well, I mean, I think there's a reason why. And so actually, I think that this predates Letty Linton. So this is actually kind of with, before this trend, which is actually fascinating. But I think that when we think about the 20s and 30s, the reason we think of it as kind of like this modern period is that there are really surprising kind of modern takes on accessories. So we're coming out of this like kind of Victorian Edwardian period in which accessories are de rigueur for women. Obviously things like shoes everyone has to wear, but gloves, hats, things like that, these are things that you have to wear in kind of polite society. Really up until like the 50s and 60s, women are wearing hats kind of out of doors. And this goes back to really kind of ancient ideas about modesty and covering the head, like kind of Judeo-Abrahamic religious ideas. And we can see those kind of analogous ideas that live on in kind of Islamic communities, and others as well. But the idea that you cover your head as like a modesty. And so we can see how this has been extrapolated into like, as into a necessity, into fashion. And by the time we get to like the late 20s into 1930s, these things have just like kind of completely morphed into these silhouettes that are very like dashing and dynamic, things that are kind of unexpected. So like the fingerless gloves that are opera length, or like this beautiful kind of hat with like the turban underneath with the scarf underneath. These are all like kind of riffs on these very, very old ideas of accessories and how you were meant to accessorize yourself when you leave the house, but turning it kind of purely really into fashion. So we kind of see this kind of historic and this modern kind of brushing up against each other. And it is surprising when you see kind of portraits like this, or even the actual material culture, how modern they can seem to us. But I love that this is actually predates kind of Letty Linton, because this was such a popular style. And so you think about where the costume designer kind of was thinking when they designed that piece. But it's also really interesting because when we think of the 1920s, we also think of flapper dresses and that's it. But there's so many other styles that are happening. And this garden party look was a very prominent one.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions about this slide in particular. On her wrists, are those bangles that we're seeing, or some sort of like bracelet? And then it also, is she wearing eyeglasses? Do we know?
Ooh, those are good questions. I don't know for sure. And of course, the style in which it's painted, it's really hard to say. It could be just a flourish of the artist, or it could be jewelry. I suspect that it is jewelry, which I think is also another really curious detail, to wear black fingerless gloves with bangles or bracelets over it. To me, it reads more like 1980s Madonna than 1920s. But that's one of the really fascinating things about this portrait.
And I definitely can't tell if she's wearing eyeglasses. It perhaps is maybe kind of like a light on her face, or but I think probably, yeah, I would definitely say that this is jewelry worn over the gloves. And so, this woman is sitting down for a portrait, so we can think about how purposeful, the way she puts on her accessories, the way she layers them. This is certainly not meant to look kind of casual or thrown together. That's like not a value that would have been kind of on this woman's mind when she was dressing for this portrait. So this idea of kind of layering the accessories, I think, is really speaks to the time, but also this idea of like this opulence, coming out of the Gilded Age and into the Roaring 20s, this idea of opulence and more, even on a look like this that is a little more kind of historically inspired.
Definitely. And then we have another question, which I'm not sure if we'll be able to answer, but do we know if Laura Wheeler Waring, illustrated for Black publications?
Ooh, good question. She was certainly in the mix. Like, she was an important figure of the Harlem Renaissance. So I imagine that she did do work for Black patrons and for Black publications. I can't name one specifically. I do know that she, along with a white artist, created a number of portraits that were, I think, displayed in the National Portrait Gallery in the 1940s, and she focused on Black figures for that exhibition. So I can't answer that question specifically, but I imagine, because who she was and the people that she associated herself with, that she probably created work for Black audiences.
Yeah. Fascinating. Thank you. And again, if you have any questions for Jonathan or Elizabeth as we go on, please feel free to drop them in the chat and I'd be happy to vocalize them for you. Thank you both.
So these are photographs of Alice Dunbar Nelson. And kind of like Sister Jones, there are a lot of images of her online. We chose these three because we just thought they were the most evocative. What strikes me about the photographs is the focus on her hair. In each photograph, her hair is styled differently in each photograph. So she was someone who paid particular attention to hairstyling.
And you can see her kind of conveying three kind of different personas again through these hairstyles. Like the one on the right is very, very fashion forward. The one in the middle is like kind of more avant-garde, still very fashionable with this kind of verticality that we see on the right. And then the one on the left is like pure kind of bohemian, kind of this bohemian romantic kind of fantasy, the way women were photographed and painted at this time, kind of bringing up this more aesthetic ideas about kind of self-presentation. But what I love about the one on the left is that she appears unclothed. I'm sure she is not completely unclothed, but ideas about Black women and their sexuality and how kind of negative that was for Black women. This woman is definitely kind of refuting that, refusing to kind of engage in those stereotypes with this photograph. And she just kind of produces something that is beautiful and artistic and not kind of obsessed by the respectability politics of that.
Liz, I have another question for you. But the image in the middle with the sort of sleeves coming up like that, is that the silhouette you're referring to in the previous slide?
So this one is a little bit earlier. So the slide before is like in 1927. It's likely a revival of like kind of this style from like the 1890s, this Lego mutton sleeve. You can't see the entire sleeve, but it definitely looks like this beautiful kind of ruffles out over a very full Lego mutton sleeve. So in 27, if we think about trends kind of recycling quickly now, but by 27, they're already kind of recycling this silhouette. But this would have been a bit earlier.
So now we want to talk about Olivia Walker. Olivia Walker was an important figure of the Harlem Renaissance. She was a businesswoman, a patron of the arts, and she's also best known for being the heiress of Madame C.J. Walker's fortune. Liz mentioned Paul Poiret earlier, and she actually met Paul Poiret when she visited Paris in 1921. And he attended one of her parties at her house on 136th Street. Sorry, I left off street, typo. A few years later. So she was a bon vivant and a hostess. When she died, Langston Hughes called her death the end of the gay times of the new Negro era in Harlem. So, I mean, in both of these photos, you see her sort of enjoying herself, enjoying her own body. In the image on the right, like it's very lavishly furnished. She was an important sort of life of the party in the Harlem Renaissance and hosted a lot of parties at her apartment.
And the connection to Paul Poiret, I love for two reasons. The first is that she was so well known for these like insane parties that she would throw. And he was also known for that in Paris, like those costumes that we saw, very much part of this kind of like this milieu he created around his own kind of lavish gatherings. And then they kind of come together also in this photograph. This is inspired again, kind of very, very loosely, you might say like kind of Russian folk like costume or something like that. But we see her wearing kind of the Turkish trousers and the boots. It's like super modern, but also kind of drawing from these folk cultures or this fantasy of it. And so it's very kind of Paul Poiret in that way. I'm not quite sure if he designed this piece, but she's obviously very, very daring, kind of, and this would have been very avant-garde fashion for the time in the 1910s. But then you see kind of her a little bit later, kind of again, kind of projecting different roles, right? She was a socialite, and there were not very many Black socialites on her level of wealth. So she was really kind of representing not just herself or her mother or her family, her mother, of course, Madam C.J. Walker, as Jonathan said, but also this new archetype, this new idea of what does a Black socialite kind of at this level look like?
And for me, the go-to scholar on Olivia Walker is a woman named Olivia Bundles, who's Olivia Walker's granddaughter. Olivia Bundles wrote a biography of Madam C.J. Walker, which I think is the best thing ever written about Madam C.J. Walker. If you're interested in Madam C.J. Walker, her history, her legacy, I would definitely check out her book, and I forget the name of it. Google it, Olivia Bundles, Madam C.J. Walker. It's a great book. And Olivia Bundles is actually writing a book right now on Olivia Walker.
Oh, nice.
And of course, she has access to the family papers and also her own just personal knowledge because it was her grandmother. So if you're interested in Olivia Walker or Madam C.J. Walker, I would tell you to look up Olivia Bundles, who's very active on Twitter and also very nice. So. So some of you might have seen, there was I think it might have been HBO Max or Netflix series on Madam C.J. Walker. Yeah, it wasn't, Olivia Bundles wasn't the biggest fan of the series, unfortunately. She was consulted in the making of the series, but actually they deviated from her advice. And so there were some inaccuracies in the series. So in the series, Olivia Walker is queer. And as far as Olivia Bundles knows, her grandmother wasn't queer. And so they took some liberties with the story to make it more salacious. But Tiffany Haddish played Olivia Walker in that series.
And again, you can compare like these two photographs. This costume that Tiffany Haddish is wearing is very like 1920s, kind of this, again, looking at kind of folk costume in a way, but also kind of neoclassical revival. And then we can compare it to this real photograph, which is kind of early 1900s into the 1910s with this like kind of lingerie dress in these white kind of laces and things, which is really, really fashionable. We see this very kind of columnar silhouette, which is of course leading into the 1920s, but like this focus on this beautiful kind of hat, this portrait hat. And we have all of this kind of focus on the head. It's very top heavy look, but really, really beautiful and kind of ethereal.
Yeah, and the costume designer for the name of the series, and I'm drawing a blank on the name of the series. It's the same name as the book, actually. But the costume designer is Karen Wagner. So I spent a lot of time thinking about the costuming in the series. I actually wrote an article about it. If you Google Madam C.J. Walker costuming fashionista, you'll find this article. But Karen Wagner did a lot of research on images of Madam C.J. Walker, images of Lelia Walker to recreate the costuming for the series. So the writing might not be the best in the series, but I can definitely vouch for the costuming.
And Tisha Dalton wrote On Her Own Ground, Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker is the name of the book. So thank you so much, Tisha.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm getting old. I'm forgetting names.
We can just crowdsource it. It's amazing. And the Netflix series is called Self-Made.
Self-Made.
Yes.
Thank you. So, modern day designers sort of draw on Madam C.J. Walker's legacy and use them in their present day designs. So the image on the left is from a recent Pierre Moss show that was actually held at Madam C.J. Walker's mansion, which is still around. It was bought by Richelieu Dennis, who is the CEO of Shea Moisture, I believe. And so that legacy is being continued. It's Shea Moisture is a Black-owned, I think, company, and it means something that a Black business person owns this mansion and is continuing giving it access to Black creative genius. So Pierre Moss held the show at Madam C.J. Walker's mansion. The image on the left is an archival image of Madam C.J. Walker's mansion, which was called Villa Loraro. There's several images of the facade of the mansion. There's one image that I think of she held a conference at Villa Loraro of all the sales associates for her beauty products. And so they're sort of lined up along the staircases that you see there. And I really wish that Pierre Moss had sort of recreated that photo or used more of the facade in the fashion show, because looking at the images, it could be any white mansion, but if they would have recreated all the archival images of Madam C.J. Walker's mansion, but in the 21st century, I thought that would have been really powerful.
And the mansion's in the Finger Lakes, and I, talk about like integrating a neighborhood. So I think again, when we're talking about Lelia, but also her mother, like what does it mean to kind of create an archetype? What does it mean to be? I mean, she's often billed as the first Black millionaire in the United States. I don't know if that is actually true. I think that might not be technically true, but it's certainly like culturally important that this woman was like the first Black millionaire, and she had this beautiful home in the Finger Lakes, and she was able to invite her employees there. And then Pierre Moss kind of picks up on this idea of bringing all of these fashion editors and people from Manhattan. I mean, really, this was a couture show sponsored by the Chambre Syndicale. So he could have had it in Paris, but he decided to have it here. And he was bringing all of these people away from like these fashion hubs to this very special place. And yeah, it actually would have been really cool if he used a little bit more of the mansion. But I'm sure for the people who attended it, being in this place and kind of thinking about like, what does it mean to be wealthy and Black? In this time period, being wealthy was really, really seen as like a virtue, that like, if you were wealthy, it's because you deserved it, that you did something right. And this was also a period of insane wealth disparity. I mean, I think it's bad now. It was really, really bad. A lot of like kind of the regulating laws that we have around industry were created because of kind of the vast inequality of this period. And so for a person who is normally kind of on the negative side of that to be on the positive side of that, that is creating a whole new idea of Blackness in America. And I think this mansion is a beautiful kind of encapsulation of that.
Absolutely. And one thing I forgot to mention is that the designs in the Pierre Moss show were actually inspired by Black inventors. And so he created looks that sort of played on things that were invented by Black people. Like I think the image on the far right is a lampshade. The image in the middle is a horseshoe. I'm not sure what the image on the left is meant to represent, but each look was a object that was invented by a Black person.
I noticed you picked like some of the looks that are much more like kind of wearable and fashiony. There's certainly looks that are very like dramatic and like less kind of wearable that really more literally depicts some Black inventions. It was a really interesting show.
It was. The looks were very fanciful. Yeah, some of them were more like wearable art and less like fashion per se. So we want to talk about Blanche Dunn, who's someone who doesn't get a lot of attention because actually there's honestly not a lot of information about her. There are a lot of images of her. You can find a lot of images of her, but there's not a lot of details about her lived experience, which is why we don't even know the year of her death. She was born in Jamaica. She was an actress and socialite, an important figure in the Harlem Renaissance. And she married briefly Richard Bruce Nugent before he came out of the closet. And he wrote of her, she knew everyone. And when they came to Harlem, everyone looked for her. A party was not a party. A place was not a place without Blanche. And so you can see in the image on the right, she played up her Caribbean heritage. Copious jewelry, sort of a long, you can't see the bottom of the skirt, but sort of a long, sort of flowing broomstick skirt. Dress practice we sometimes associate with the Caribbean. A blouse with a scoop neck or exposed décolletage. So she sort of played into her Jamaican nationality.
And what's so interesting, I think, about this image is that it's really such a important image when we think about creating a persona, right? And how people draw on their own heritage, or in this case, her own heritage, but people in many cases draw on other people's other cultures to kind of bring these elements together and kind of really create something that is very in your face. There's nothing subtle kind of about this look. And this was a choice that she made, drawing on this particular area of the world. Like the Caribbean is such a, we see these diasporic traditions that I think are not as obvious, perhaps to us as Americans. I think when Black Americans go to the Caribbean, we see this very kind of direct line of kind of culture to the continent. And so I think that when she brings those understandings of that culture and mixes it with her understandings of kind of the way Blackness is perceived in Harlem, even by other Black folks, but especially by white folks, and she creates this image, she's really kind of taking control of that, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah, there's a scholar who I really admire. We both really admire, Monica Miller. And there's a phrase that she used once, and it always stuck with me, but she called this practice Hotentoten the self. So exoticizing yourself, like stripping the power out of these stereotypes by claiming it and using it for your own benefit. And Hotentoten the self is a bit extreme, but it's kind of what's happening in this photograph.
And I think like the most obvious person you can think about who does this is Josephine Baker, right? Who like has these things put on her, these ideas of exoticism put on her, and then she kind of reclaims it. I think it's also important to note that she discards it, pretty early in her career. She had a very long career, but we see other Black women kind of playing with their persona in this way. That is it, and it also like really very much feeds into kind of fashion in this period in the 20s and 30s as well. We talked a little bit but previously about this idea of exoticism and how designers are drawing from different parts of the world, but this was really important for American designers who are trying to distinguish themselves from Parisian design. And one way they did this was looking at other people's cultures, both kind of within the United States, like Native American kind of motifs and things, but also looking at places like the continent, like the Caribbean, as kind of new sources of inspiration that were not just copies of what was happening in Paris.
Yeah, I mean, this is the height of Negrophilia, like the craze for Harlem, the craze for jazz, and like white designers were taking cultural elements from the Caribbean, from the African continent, from the non-Western world, and incorporating it into like Western silhouettes and accessories. So you see like leopard prints or like the Nancy Kennard like wearing like copious jewelry. Of course, it was sanitized, um, elevated, but in the case of someone like you mentioned Josephine Baker, which would have been, we didn't include her in today's presentation because it's kind of obvious choice. We wanted to focus on less obvious individuals, but you see it in Josephine Baker, and you also see it in this image of Blanche Dunn. These are some more images of Blanche Dunn. Like I said, there are a lot of images of her. She posed for Carl Van Vechten, who was sort of the go-to photographer for Harlem Renaissance figures. So there are a lot of images by him of her, but like Ciceretta Jones, like Alice Dunbar Nelson, she was obviously someone who was considered beautiful and at the same time also used her beauty to her advantage.
And comparing like these photographs to the one before, you can see just how much of kind of that is in a persona that she puts on, like how all fashion is this persona that she puts on. You see kind of three very different vibes happening in these three photographs.
And so we wanted to talk about Isabel Washington Powell. So Isabel was a dancer and actress, but she also married civil rights activist and minister Adam Clayton Powell Jr. While she was performing at the Cotton Club, and she later married him. Isabel Washington Powell also is known for being Freddie Washington's sister, and Freddie Washington was the actress in the 1934 film version of Imitation of Life. There's been several versions of Imitation of Life. Sometimes the main character is played by a white woman, but in the 1934 version, it was played by Freddie Washington, who's a very light-skinned African-American woman. And in the film, a young light-skinned woman of color passes for white, and it has a very tragic ending. I'm not going to tell you how it ends, just in case you want to watch it. If I were to create a syllabus for tonight's presentation, I would include Imitation of Life on the syllabus. But like Blanche Dunn and like many figures that we've talked about tonight, there are just a lot of images of her online. And I think of all the figures that we've talked about tonight, I think she lives the longest. She lived well into the 21st century. So she's a really interesting figure for a number of reasons.
And when we think about the wives of our civil rights kind of leaders, I love these two images because like this totally bucks the trend of kind of what you think of when you think of Malcolm X's wife, when you think of Martin Luther, you think of Coretta Scott King, like, you know, and like the respectability politics that were so caught up in the civil rights movement. And I love that this woman started as like a showgirl with this like amazing style.
And when we were preparing for today's presentation, Liz reminded me, is like, we have to talk about colorism. Like many of the figures that we included in today's presentation are light-skinned. And I think just thinking about Freddie Washington's life, you know, particularly like the advantages that she had as a very light-skinned, almost white passing woman of color, I think it's important to remember why these women were considered beautiful. And in the image on the left, you see both Freddie Washington and Isabel Washington Powell alongside each other. And you can see that in some ways, I would say that Freddie Washington could pass in a way that Isabel Washington Powell couldn't. I mean, this is only one photo, but
And if you can compare the photos of Freddie Washington on the left and the right, you can see how styling kind of makes such a big difference.
Yeah. And also, I mean, this is a bit of a aside, but thinking about passing, um, in Rebecca Hall in the recent Netflix movie, people had a critique of the movie that she chose two actresses that in reality couldn't pass. But I really like the actresses that she chose because I think the point of her choosing um, women of color who look like women of color is because um, she wanted to show that race is not only about how you look, it's a performance. It's how like, and I think just what you said about how styling is part of like racial performance as well. So
And so I want to talk a little bit about kind of like the impact of this kind of drawing on Caribbean culture and for Black women and how it kind of manifests. And I think one of the most obvious ways that it's manifested in really, really important cultural ways is through dance. So here we have images of Katherine Dunham, who was not just a dancer, she was an anthropologist, a PhD. She went to the Caribbean to study dance cultures and document them, but she also had her own dance company. So like a woman who like did it all. And you can see how she looked at kind of the, the costuming that was prevalent in, among dancers in the Caribbean, and she recreated it in her own kind of costuming. And so you can think about like this Hottentot kind of persona, but for her, it was really much more about kind of celebrating kind of Caribbean dance culture in its entirety. And it's important to realize that this is a costume that she's donning for the stage, but performances like this and the popularity of the Katherine Dunham Company really did help to drive the popularity of kind of Caribbean inspired styles in mainstream fashion. And it became really baked into kind of the American look from like the 30s, 40s, even into the 50s. And this idea that, American women versus Parisian women they were more casual, they were more sporty, but a lot of these kind of influences into that came from the Caribbean through conduits like the American dancer Katherine Dunham. And then I also include on the right, Carmen de Lavalade and Jeffrey Holder. Jeffrey Holder was from Trinidad. He was Caribbean. Carmen de Lavalade was American, but you can see, again, they're in costume here, but you can see kind of those beautiful influences and how they disseminate into popular culture among both Black and white people through kind of this costuming.
and I think Katherine Dunham is a really understudied figure. Like I've studied a lot of Brazilian history, and there was an incident in Brazil in which she was pointing towards the service elevator as opposed to like the guest elevator, and that was like the jumping off point for a number of like early anti-racism legislation in Brazil, and that one incident was the cause of that. I think that's really interesting. But also, if you look at like dancers, like Black dancers in like mid-century U.S., they often worked under Katherine Dunham, so she mentored a lot of people, and you know I think a Katherine Dunham exhibition needs to happen. I don't know who's gonna host it.
We were able to include two of her costumes in an exhibition we did at the museum at FIT in 2013 called Dance in Fashion. I believe we borrowed them from St. Louis. She's from, or she ended up settling in St. Louis, and I believe there's a museum devoted to her there. So that's where we borrowed them from. But they're beautiful kind of costumes. And hopefully there's like a whole exhibition worth of them. I mean, obviously you can have a lot of different objects. It doesn't have to be a fashion exhibition, but if you did do one, I think her fashion and styling in her costuming was really important aspect.
And I would say the same for Jeffrey Holder and Carmen de Lavalade.
There was an exhibition about them at the California African American Museum, which I was very, very lucky to see because he was a dancer, he was an actor. You might, audience might know him from James Bond movie that he was in, the one that's set in New Orleans.
Live and Let Die.
Live and Let Die. He plays kind of a Haitian kind of voodoo practitioner, but he was a costume designer. He designed like the stage costumes for The Wiz when it was on Broadway and many others. He was a dancer, he was a choreographer. He also made a lot of Carmen de Lavalade's clothing. We are very lucky to have an ensemble that he made for her in our collection that we had for Black fashion designers. They're an amazing couple. And like, I think she was like one of the first Black ballerinas to dance at the Met. Like they definitely deserve much, much more attention.
And Carmen de Lavalade is still alive.
Yes, she is.
So, we can still talk to her and hear those stories. So I would love for someone to like remount that show. Um, yeah, and Jeffrey Holder's brother was an artist, Bosco Holder,
Mhm.
and a dad.
And talent just runs in families.
Mhm.
And she actually, Carmen de Lavalla, we could talk about her, I guess, for all day. I'll just add that she's one who convinced Alvin Ailey that he should get into dance. So there's that.
Wow. Oh my God.
Yeah.
All right, so this is a concluding slide. Taking inspiration from the current exhibition on Ethel Reed, we explored under-acknowledged Black it girls and tastemakers from the turn of the century. But it's also important to remember that Black women have influenced global taste since the beginning of contact between Europeans and people of African descent. I think about my own research. I studied this dynamic a century earlier, like the turn of the 18th century into the 19th century, and how Black women were shaping European tastes even back then. So this list is far from exhaustive. In fact, when we were creating this presentation, Liz and I went back and forth over who to include in the presentation. We had a list that was twice this size. And Liz was like, we don't have time to talk about all these women.
Because I knew we were going to talk about them for a long time.
Right. So we could have included Ida B. Wells or Madam C.J. Walker or Mary Church Terrell, but we really wanted to focus on individuals who get less attention. But one thing we would ask you all who are watching, like, who would you have included in this presentation? Like, who do we miss? Who would you have liked to have seen included in the presentation? So thank you for listening to us. We would love to get your questions. Please feel free to follow me on any of these social media platforms. Liz isn't very active on social media, but you should plug all the amazing projects that you're working on right now.
So I'm at the museum at FIT, which is on 27th and 7th if you're in the city. We have a beautiful exhibition that just opened on Dior and Balenciaga that was curated by our deputy director. But the next show that I'm working on is on hip hop fashion with hip hop fashion scholar and journalist Elena Romero. So we're co-curating an exhibition that will open February 2023, and that will be the 50-year anniversary of hip hop. And then in the fall of 2023, I'm co-curating with my colleague at the museum, Melissa Mara, an exhibition on food and fashion, which is going to be very, very fun. So if you go to the museum at FIT's website, you can see upcoming exhibitions as well as current exhibitions, as well as our programming.
Liz, you forgot something.
What did I forget?
And Lo.
Oh, yes. I'm also, oh my God, I'm the worst. You should be my publicist. I'm also guest curating an exhibition at the Winterthur Museum in Delaware on the designer Anne Lowe. She's an amazing, amazing Black fashion designer. She designed Jacqueline Kennedy's wedding dress, which I think is what she's most known for, but like had an amazing oeuvre of beautiful gowns. And we're doing an exhibition, which also opens fall 2023. So stay tuned.
Jonathan, Elizabeth, thank you so much. This was so fantastic, engaging, and informative. I know I certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did too. Our chat is already overflowing with suggestions of who people would have included had they been given free rein. But I also just want to, again, if you have any questions for Jonathan or Elizabeth about this presentation, please, now's the time to drop them in the chat or in the Q&A box so that we can sort of address those. I just want to read out a few of like the suggestions of like folks who people wish were included in this presentation. Josephine Premise, Ida B. Wells, favorite of all time, of course. Marian Anderson, Bessie Smith, and then just like a lot of love for like the presentation and what you all were able to include in such a short time. Mary Lavalade, sorry.
Mary de Lavalade, I believe. I don't see where it is, but I'm Marie de Lavalade.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, again, lots and lots of like just praise for everything that you've included. Again, if there's any questions for Jonathan or Liz, like now is the time to drop them in. I have my own question, which I'd love to hear sort of your take on this. So sort of like the topic or our jumping off point for this conversation was like it girls, right? Of like the turn of the century. And I'm sort of like noticing this thread of sort of like transgressiveness that we're sort of seeing throughout this presentation, as well as in Ethel Reed's like own work. Do you think that like that's sort of like a defining trait of the it girl, like even today for yeah.
I would definitely say yes. I feel like you have to be on the precipice of something new or slightly ahead. It can't be too far ahead of it, but on the precipice, right on the cutting edge, because that's what's going to make you different and fascinating, right? We're like interested in like what is this woman doing? What does she look like? It's so different from what I'm doing, and I do think that really makes it kind of that's kind of what makes an it girl. What do you think, Jonathan?
Yeah, I would agree. And I mean, that's where fashion comes in, because fashion is all about novelty. It's all about the next thing. And all these figures were sort of on the cutting edge of fashion. So I think the transgressiveness that you're like making note of is also like one of the sort of defining characteristics of what makes something fashion. Like they weren't, plain Janes. You wanted to know what they were wearing and where they were going and who they were rubbing shoulders with.
Totally, thank you. Also, like Jonathan, you brought up like a really interesting point around like this. I forget you had like a specific term that you referenced, and I'm blanking on it now, but I'm gonna describe it as like self-exotification. How do you sort of like define the line between sort of like authenticity and self-exotification, or if you could repeat the term that you used earlier? Sorry.
Yeah, it was a weird term. It's Hotentoten the Self, which is a reference to Hotentot Venus, Sarah Bartman, who was a South African woman who was enslaved, more or less, and put on display in Western Europe, and died in captivity. So there's been a lot of scholarship on her life and the ways in which she was exploited, and actually dissected. After her death, her body was actually dissected. Um, so the scholar that I reference is Monica Miller, someone who I admire greatly, actually modeled my career after Monica Miller. She wrote a book called Slaves to Fashion, which is it's a book about enslaved people's dress. If I were to make a syllabus for this presentation, I would include Imitation of Life, and I would also include Slaves to Fashion. But Monica Miller, this is not actually in the book. It's something that she said in a presentation, but she had this term called Hotentoten the Self, which is a reference to Hotentot Venus, Sarah Bartman. Which is the act of exoticizing yourself in an effort to strip the stereotype of any power. And I forgot your question.
So how do you sort of like draw the line between like that and sort of like authenticity, like embracing or like exploring like your own like culture or like roots, like in a very like public facing way?
I think it's a fine line. And I think figures who walk that line are constantly stepping over it. I think about someone like Cardi B. And I think Cardi B does a really good job of walking that line, but there's times that she's stepped over it. So how do you sort of like lean into what makes you authentic, what makes you real, without exoticizing yourself, and at the same time, you know, benefiting from it? But at the same time, Cardi B has also been vilified and stigmatized for being authentic. So it's a really fine line. And
And it's completely subjective on who's watching and who's giving their opinion. Like one thing can be perfectly acceptable to one person, or like something that induces pride because you share a culture, and it could be totally unacceptable to someone in that same culture.
Definitely. Well, thank you both. No,
Yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it brings up really interesting ideas about how diverse the diaspora is, and how like Blackness is so tied to kind of region and specific culture, and that, just because you're Black doesn't mean you have access to, kind of cultural access to every single aspect of kind of Blackness.
Definitely.
And I also think it goes back to something that sorry, I keep on cutting you off, Salvador. Are you trying to wrap up?
Mm-mm.
Okay.
Oh, please, I'm here for as long as you all.
We'll make this the last point, Jonathan.
Okay. But respectability politics, it's something that you think about a lot, Liz, in your research. And so like that's one thing that, you know, someone like Cardi B or someone like that we included in our presentation, they're constantly navigating. Like, how do you be true to yourself and true to your understanding of the world, but also navigate the expectations of you as someone who might be female identified or to be a woman of African descent. So I think all of these women, I think I think the biggest example is Isabel Washington Powell. You know, she was a burlesque dancer at the Cotton Club, and she married a civil rights activist and a minister at Abyssinian Baptist Church. And so how does she navigate, you know, being someone in the entertainment industry, but also, you know, being a few years later becoming a minister's wife?
Totally. Jonathan, Elizabeth, I want to thank you both so much for your time today. Again, this was a fantastic presentation, and I know I learned a lot. Yeah, and I want to thank you all for attending this evening. If you haven't had a chance to see Ethel Reed, I Am My Own Property, it's on view through mid-August at Poster House. We're located in the heart of Chelsea. You can hit up both us and the FIT Museum at the same time. And yeah, again, just thank you so much for sharing this. This video will be recorded and made available to all registered attendees. Yeah, and I hope to see you at the museum soon.
Thank you so much, Salvador, and thank you for everyone for joining us.
Yes, thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.